Welcome to the South by East podcast.
Welcome to the South by East podcast, where we discuss culture, the scriptures, and everything in between, and how they impact Southeast Topeka with your co-hosts, Jonathan Sublett and Braille Watson.
Welcome back, fans, to South by East Season 2 Generations. And I'm super excited about the guest that we have here today. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about Jake?
Well, I gotta introduce this first. I
do
remember
it.
One of the first programs that I led, man, when I went out in this church planting world was this program called Kids Club. And I remember one of my friends coming in who was a photographer, and she brought her kids with her to be and spend time with the group that night, and she was going to teach them about different careers and stuff. So she asked the kids what they wanted to be, and most of the kids at that time were saying like football star. And and she's like, okay, if that don't work out, what are you going to do? Okay, I'll go play basketball then. And so she's
My
like,
second choice.
Okay, what's another backup plan? And her son was like, I want to be a computer programmer. And they were like, what?
Okay.
What's that? What do you want to do? He said,
jump.
He's like, I want to make video games.
Oh, man.
That's why I want to be a computer. And they were like, hold
on.
up. They were like, that's who does that? And, and they were like, that's what I want to do. And so all the kids, until that point, the kids in that club had never heard or thought that was a possibility. And so our guest today, Jake Dunagan, is the same way. About a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, I met Jake Dunagan in a program called Kansas Future Fellows, where 11 people were selected from around the state of Kansas to help develop solutions for the next 75 to 100 years. And Jake is a futurist. I didn't know that. I was like the kids in the program, right? Wait, where you want to be? I want to be a pastor. I want to be a community developer. Okay, if they don't work out, what else? He's like, I want to be a futurist. I'm like, what is that? Right. And so this is a great opportunity, because in first episode, we kicked off the season looking at the beginning of the educational cycle by looking at early childhood education and the policies that help shape the whole chain. And so this one, we're actually fast forwarding. We're looking at the very end, a possibility of what it could be far out. And so we're going to kind of bookend all this with these two episodes, and then we're going to spend the next several episodes after this kind of filling in the middle. Yeah. So I'm excited about this conversation that bro gets to have, and I think it's going to stretch his mind some on where this thing goes, because I know that the stuff that he had us reading as a part of the program and different things really challenged my thinking. And so it caused me to think in a different way. And so I'm looking forward to it. And I think part of it, where we got to go with this, is looking at how to have a system with a tighter feedback loop to show us if we're really going toward where we need to go.
I love it. Man, well, I'm excited to learn something. I hope that y'all learn something with me. So let's jump into that interview, into the intersection with Jake Dunagan. All right, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and germs, we are back in the intersection with someone who is truly a futuristic thinker, dreamer, and creator, Mr. Jake Dunagan. How you doing today, Jake?
Good, Braille. How you doing?
Man, hey, I'm blessed, man. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be here having conversations with people as smart as yourself. And so I always love it when I'm not the smartest person in the room. I get the opportunity to learn, and so I'm glad to be in this space.
Undersell, man. Undersell. Like
understand? Under promise, over deliver, right?
That's right.
Under promise, over deliver. Man, and so I want to take this chance to be able to get right into it, Jake. Living in the community that we live in, where we have high levels of poverty. Studies say that people who live in desperate poverty actually live in a constant state of fight or flight. And so it's almost impossible to really think and dream and look out at the future. But that is really what you do for a living. And that is an incredible thing to think about. Can you describe for us a little bit about what it means to be a futurist, and why is this field important for us to understand?
Yeah, well, even just a step back to that comment about, sort of living in the moment, fight or flight. I mean, I feel like that's not really even just the domain of people struggling. It's kind of everybody. I think that's why everybody's feeling it. It's because, you could be a billionaire and you're getting hit by, climate issues or pandemics. Like, that affects you too. So I think we're all, in a sense, we're all in that same boat, and we're going to have to figure it out. How do you think about the future when you're trying to survive in the present? And so that dilemma, I think, is what we're all facing. But, the field of futures and this way of thinking, I mean, in a sense, that's what humans do. First of all, before I get into the field and where that came from, and the sort of history of that domain, thinking about the future is what all humans do. This philosopher named Andy Clark says that we're all kind of prediction engines. That we're all running through things, even if we are in a sort of moment to moment existence and things are sort of hitting us, we actually are thinking about, like, if I do this, what happens? And our brains are running through scenarios. If I'm going down a grocery line, like, do I pick this or that? Is my kid going to like that? We're running through scenarios and simulations in our minds all the time at different scales. And sometimes it's like, okay, should I go to this college, or should I take this job, or, should I marry this person or go on a date? So we're always running through at different scales. And so that's part of what our brains do. The trouble is that we're not very good at it. There's a lot of neuroscience and psychology that shows that we're really bad at kind of predicting our own future, especially our own emotional states, our own happiness, or like, okay, if I take this job, I'm going to be happy. Well, we're actually wrong about that quite a bit. So the idea of future studies and the field, in one way, it's kind of a personal thing. Like, how do we get better at that? But also it scales to society at large. Like, how do we get better as a civilization or society at making these choices together? Because we're also, in a sense, kind of bad as a society. Some of those same biases and some of those same problems, blind spots occur at a social level. So the field kind of came out of World War II, like, as a discipline. Like, let's do this as a society. Let's figure out ways that we can look ahead more usefully. So we're not always blindsided by change. So we're not always learning the hard way. And again, sort of like as an individual, we're kind of bad at it. I think we're kind of bad at it right now as a society. We need to improve those capacities, those institutions of foresight. And so I think that's what it's all about. It's like understanding the need for that. We need to think ahead. We need to sort of get ahead and not always be reacting. And maybe we can learn some actual skills and some feedback loops to say, how do we get better at it? How do we do this? How do I do it as an individual? Of course, that's important. How do we do it? Our institutions, our governing institutions, but also how do we do it really almost as a species? If we get that large, because everything's on the table. Like our survival with climate change or with inequality, or, wars and all. Everything's on the table for survival. So I think we need this to, not to get too grandiose, but I think we need this kind of thinking in order to be able to make it out of this century, honestly.
Yeah, and it almost feels like what you're saying is we're talking about developing systems to help us in our daily lives where our ability stops. We have systems that help us to plug in and take that next step, and then hopefully over time help us grow our ability.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly. Like, okay, we have limitations. All right. We need this thing. We need it to work this way. We need our brains and our society to work this way. We know where we're going off course. We know where our limitations are. Some of it's biological and neurological. Some of it's cultural. We sort of get locked in. Some of it's system based. Okay, all of the incentive structures in our economy are based around a certain kind of way. So right. All of those things are the challenge. But how do we overcome that? And we this is what humans do when we build things. Like, I mean, we can critique the court system, but the point was, like, how do we administer justice fairly? Right. If somebody is accused of something, we decided, or we understood that person can't make a judgment, an objective judgment. So we tried to create juries of peers, and again with all the problems of that. But the ideal of that was to build a system that's beyond us that can actually accomplish something approaching justice that we can't do ourselves. That we knew that we couldn't sort of functionally make that happen without some help. So almost everything in human society is to expand us, but in some sense overcome some of our limitations. And again, because it's existential now, I think the urgency is as great as it's ever been for those kind of things, for foresight, for thinking ahead, for not being blindsided by change.
Yeah, and I like how you said it's something that we have to do, use the word as a species.
Yeah.
You know, when we talk about things that are alive, one of the measuring factors of things that are alive is if they move and if they grow. If something stops growing, it starts dying. Like it's the end, right? It starts dying. And so thinking about us as a species, not just as a community, and I want to take a second to kind of look at that broader scope. So what are some things that you're seeing in the ecosphere of the world that maybe we're not seeing here yet in the Midwest? You know, I worked in the music industry, and we used to always say, man, the Midwest is always behind. Something's going to happen on the West Coast, it's going to become popular and popping, and then it's going to be several months before we hear it on the radio here in the Midwest. And same thing with the East Coast. It's just part of being in the middle of the map, which I love and I respect, but we tend to be behind, right? And so, man, what are some of the global risks that are facing society right now that maybe we should be paying attention to, like here in the U.S. and especially here in the middle of the U.S.?
Well, I grew up in Alabama, so I was even behind y'all. So don't sweat it.
I respect it.
Yeah, I mean, like the risks that are out there. You know, I wouldn't say that you're not seeing it. I think we all are. I mean, that's one of the conditions of modern times is that we're kind of seeing everything all at once. So, you know, a hospital in Ukraine gets bombed, we know about it immediately. You know, so I think we're all sort of feeling the weight of all of the sort of the things that are happening, the risks around the world. So, I mean, you know, I could sit here and talk about, you know, the climate catastrophe that we're in right now, and droughts in the West, and, you know, flooding on one end and earthquakes on another. I mean, that's not per se climate related, but we can't rely on the ground below us. That's one big thing,
right?
You know, or like you know, nuclear weapons are still a thing, right? That's even though we don't have the Cold War, it's still an issue, you know, or you know, pandemics on our minds. Like those are the big things. But I think it's sorry I know you're about to say something, but I just want to finish this point. You know, to me, there's like the biggest risk or the biggest crisis is almost invisible or unnameable. It's like, what's our story as a species? I keep going to that level, but I think it's important. Like, what are we about? You know, like does religion hold us together enough to, like, you know, make it the story that we're going to be behind? Is it enlightenment, you know, and scientific development and progress and that narrative? You know, I feel like we have a kind of crisis of purpose in a way. Like, what are we about? You know, I work a lot with universities and have this conversation with them. What are you about? What's a university? Is it to train people to be workers? Is it to make us be the best people we can, like that kind of enlightenment version of that? But I think we have that in a sense as a species. And I think we're struggling with that, like to find meaning, because the old stories aren't working enough for everybody. And we don't have, this has been said in many different ways, but we don't have new ones yet. So we're sort of, we're here. Like, what are we about? And so, you know, I think foresight and maybe even beyond that, like what are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think we're struggling with that story, which cascades down to war, and it cascades to being able to deal with public health issues, and it deals with our ability to deal with climate. You know, so anyway, I think that's the high level thing that sort of has an umbrella over a lot of the problems we have, and you know,
and I think you hit on something really important there when you talked about the old stories aren't working. The old stories aren't working anymore. And what are the new what is the new story that we need to be telling? And is it powerful enough to overcome some of the risks that we're seeing? And like one of our core values here is discipleship. And in our worldview, discipleship means taking what we learn from the story of Jesus Christ and teaching it to others in a way that where they can live that out and replicate that. It's taking the story of something that we think it gives hope to the entire world, something that we think changes the playing field right now because of what we see coming in the future and what has come, right? And so it's telling that story in a way to where that can be transmitted to others and begin to allow them to feel that same impact, right? And I think one of the ways we do that is through our educational system. So as we look at the risks and the things that we see that are impacting the world, what type of impact do we see happening on our educational system, especially here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those institutions that carries a lot of that weight, and we put it on it. I mean, it's from the time you're 3, 4, 5 years old till, I mean, the way it's designed now, you're like 22 or 25 or something like that. It's like, okay, well, it's everything. It's forming you into the person you are in a sense. Going back to that theme, we've offloaded that part of it from families or from your neighborhood into society. Okay, we built these schools to do something, to create the kind of people that we want to be and want to be around. And, I think the crisis of everything, the crisis of meaning is embedded in the crisis of education too. We don't want to teach, woke because we don't want a world like that, or, everything is sort of flowing into that world. And it's sort of like, it's carrying the weight of what we're supposed to be. And maybe it shouldn't. I mean, that's a part. Maybe we're asking it to do too much. And maybe, we need to fill in the gaps, but it is one of our main institutions. And if we can get the story of education right, I mean, I think it's one of those linchpin things that maybe spin out to, okay, what are we all about? Is it all about planetary protection? Like maybe that's the purpose of education, is so we can make a sustainable world. I mean, that is appealing, or is it, like spiritual edification? Like we need to get back out of just like learning how to do addition and what's life about. Like let's educate to, that. So the paradigms of education, I think, to me, are like a microcosm of what this whole big story that we're trying to work out.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, and that's also, I think, what makes it difficult, right? If we've created a system to recreate us and to grow us, and we don't know who we are, then the system, how do we rate the efficacy of the system, right? How do we know that the system is working well when we can't really agree on who we are? And you said something in there that I put a pin in my mind of, we offload a lot onto that system. Should we? Right? We met with Melissa Rooker recently of the Kansas Children's Cabinet, executive director of the Kansas Children's Cabinet. And there was a part of the conversation with her and Jonathan that really stuck out to me, where she started talking about how early childhood education is something that happens in the culture, in the environment that you come up with, it not just in the school, but everywhere. And I believe that is also a part of what we need to see in our educational system, is that it becomes a part of our communities, not somewhere where people are sent, because the history of the American education system does not lend itself well to being what I would call a philanthropic society, right? It was created with a purpose to create a certain type of person, And as we have changed how we're evaluating what that certain type of person is, we're not necessarily trying to get factory workers out of school anymore. Right. That hasn't been the goal for quite some time. We're trying to get innovators and thinkers in a system that has been created to really breed obedience. Is not useful for creating innovation and thinkers. And so, man, as I look at the system, so I've got 4 kids, right? 12, 2, and 3. And so 2 of my kids go to a child care worker that lives just a few houses away from me. And we couldn't live without her, man. She has been doing an amazing job with our kids. And they found not just education, but community with her. And the school system that my older students are in, it has a lot of issues in it. I meet a lot of great people, but there are also a lot of hurdles that we're trying to overcome, which is part of the reason that we're doing this series, right? Is because we see the hurdles and we want to start thinking about solutions. But so as a futurist, I think it's really easy to see the problems, right? But as a futurist and someone with children, right? How many kids do you have, Jake?
I have two boys, 14 and 10.
14 and 10. So around the same age, high school, middle school, around the same age as mine. As you look at the landscape of education, what possible futures do you see that get you excited about education? What are the things that you're like, man, if we lean in here, we have the potential to create something great in 2050? Right?
Yeah, I'm going to hold back my cynicism and say nothing, and run off in a different direction. But I will challenge myself to come up with some things. I mean, okay, let's just think about the last, say, 4 years. COVID broke a pattern, and that was bad, right? It was not expected, and some dealt with it okay, some others. But people started their own little neighborhood schools, like there was just an unleashing, maybe an unanchoring of the old system. So you commit to the old system because, well, maybe it's not great, but it's still working. So that was a door to be one of those latches that opened up. Okay, new things are possible there. So I don't know what it's going to be, and maybe we revert back to something terrible. I mean, that's a possibility too. We just go back because we don't know anything else. We don't have another model. But I think there's a sense of what matters and what doesn't that came out of that, and what's important. I don't get so stressed out if my kid misses a day. Maybe I would have 5 years ago. Like, you gotta go. So maybe, trying to reprioritize maybe is the best short word for that. What is it? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
So there's that opening, I think, and new models, and we can do more remote, and maybe we don't have to do this time-based thing where you have to be in a certain room for a certain amount of time. So I think we're still working through that, and we're not even at the tip of the iceberg of what's sort of, I think, unleashed by that. And then the second part is just the large language models and the Chat GPT thing, which is okay. Yeah, that's a threat to schools, and it can write a personal essay in 10 seconds, and I don't do that anymore. So that,
could
in
you
a way,
speak to some of that for people listening who haven't heard of that or aren't familiar with what that is?
Right. Yeah, it's like on everyone's mind, so I'm just so used to thinking about it. But it's basically, if you think about like asking a question of a search engine, like when did the Hindenburg explode or whatever? Okay, that's fine. I have that. But you could ask this tool, and it uses all the stuff that's been created before to sort of guess at what it would sound like. So it creates new stuff, original stuff. It's not just pointing you to things that exist, but it's sort of creating out of the mix of things that have been written before. It'd be like, write me a historical essay on the Hindenburg, from the point of view of a comedian in the 60s. And it can put those things together and create something that's, it's not like mind blowing, but it's also pretty damn mind blowing because of how close it is. It's like, this is good. This is like a freshman level report that I could, I could put in. This is pretty good. It's almost there. So it just takes all of that kind of a level of like writing and responding, and like a lot of the stuff we do in school is just turning that out, and it automates it. Yeah.
And Jake, on that, man, what we've seen is, one, the Chat GPT stuff is still driving a greater need for true education. And I say that because Google tried to launch their own deal, and it had a mistake, and it cost them $1 billion.
right.
Like, in stock right away.
Yeah.
But then, if you're cynical like me, which I know you are, you have a
in the best way though, in the positive way.
Yeah. You have a reservation when people come out too often and say this is groundbreaking. Well, but that field did have two groundbreaking things really close, because you had Chat GPT, then you had somebody that developed a software for teachers to be able to use to see if somebody used the software to complete the assignment.
Right.
But then, just recently, Microsoft has started piloting where they've tied Chat GPT to their Bing search engine, which has totally changed the game in search engines, which is really, search engines are the basic thing for the internet.
Right.
And so now you can type in like a paragraph like, hey, I want to prepare dinner for me and my wife. She doesn't eat chicken and asparagus. What should I fix? and it'll spit out a paragraph, not just a whole bunch of links of recipes,
Right. Exactly.
but actually paragraph saying, I think you recommend this going with this. And then you can say, well, that sounds great. Give me a shopping list for that recipe, and I want it sorted by aisles at this grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft has done that.
Where's Will Smith? That's good. Where is Will Smith at? iRobot is.
So putting all this together, which is what we try to do as futurists. So you think about the form changing, like going to school, learning in a certain way, like that's been upturned to a degree by COVID and other things. You've got the content changing now, like okay, what am I actually producing when I'm there? So that's kind of up for grabs in a way that's different. And then you got the function. I mean, the sort of purpose. What's the point kind of thing? Like, so that's in play too. And I think in a different way. So you got the recipe for, like I said, everything on the table. What is this about? How is it going to be shaped? And what are we going to do when we get there? And I think it's a great opportunity to rethink all of those systems and say, okay, what do we want to be? How do we want to design this? We have an opportunity. Not saying we're going to take it, because there's a lot of stupid factors out there that are going to distort it, but it does open the door for, I think, a radical transformation that maybe wasn't available to people. We wouldn't take that leap because they were so dependent on the old system. But now I think we have that opportunity, and imagine a new way of teaching that's not. I mean, it's not just go write me an essay and come back and deliver it, but I'm going to do everything by conversation. I need to know if you as a human can answer this question. It's like Socratic method, or like there are schools that do this where you need to have an interaction. So it may change the kind of relationships that teachers and students have. All right, we can cover that. We know that we're never going to get ahead. It's an arms race between the machines and how do they figure out if the machine wrote it. We never may be able to overcome that. But let's not try to win that race. Let's say, okay, let me have a teacher and 8 students, and we're going to walk around like Plato or Socrates, and we're gonna have a walking school, and you're not gonna be on your machines. I'm gonna have a conversation with you. We're gonna talk, and I'm gonna ask you questions. I mean that model. Yeah, I mean maybe there are old models, that we could rely on. Maybe there's something new that we haven't even thought about before that we could employ that. But that all of the relationships that we have between school and society, between students and teachers, between machines and the tools that we use to educate ourselves, I think that all of those things are going to be transformed or in the midst of transformation, and so there's hope there maybe.
I would love to see. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of the model that we use for most public school now. I like the Montessori model. I like a model that is more conversational and that has more dialogue involved, because that's how discipleship works, really. It is life on life. That's how most of the greatest things that we learn in life are caught, not taught. Even the things that we are taught usually don't really start applying to our lives and don't really lock into the old part of our brain until we pair them with experiences. So we know that we learn better in environments where trust is high. We know that we learn better in environments where we're able to put hands on to attach emotion and moral value to it. We already know that helps us to learn better. And our current model doesn't address that. And I think that's why when we lost connection, even more so during the pandemic, we started to see the holes in the comforter. We started to, now it's cold outside. This comforter's too short. There's holes in here. This doesn't actually meet the need of keeping me warm. It's just, it was 75. So I never really noticed. And people who tend to run cold, we were like, well, man, they're outliers. It doesn't. And now we're seeing it's like, oh man, this need is not really being met. Man, and so as we move forward, man, as we start to kind of wrap up, because you've given us a lot to chew on, a lot to process, what is the value of a futures mindset, and how does it apply? I want to take it to a few specific places. How can our listeners apply the values that you've talked about today of having a futures mindset to, as an individual, from the institutional standpoint, and from as a society? And I can throw those back. You don't have to keep them all in your head and run them. But I just want to think through that. So how can we apply the values of future thinking to us as individuals? What can we do?
It's funny because I have a running joke that I'm really bad at personal foresight. Like, where did I leave where are we going? Or like, I forgot to bring this to the picnic or whatever. Like, so
my wife is basically an accountant.
All right. Yeah.
Our budget. What were you saying, Jake? What were you saying?
Yeah. No. You're right. Right on point. Yeah. The impulse buying and not thinking ahead at a personal level. I'm shockingly bad at that. But so there's neuroscience and psychology that can come to bear, and a lot of futurists work on personal foresight. How do I not take a debt in? How do I not get $80,000 in debt on a degree that I don't want to be in? Like, very, very big things and very little things too. But there are a whole host of tools and techniques. I mean, part of the overall theme here is overcoming our blind spots and biases. Like we do it all the time, but we're actually understanding where we miss things. Where am I missing that? If recency bias, if it's happened in the near past, it sort of colors my vision of the future. It's a bias that I need to get over, or proximity. If it's happening near me, if there's a toxic train wreck, I'm thinking about the future in terms of toxic train wrecks because that's happening, right around me. We just had an ice storm in Austin, so I'm thinking about ice storms that are coloring my future. So we're sort of blinded by the present in a way. We have to deal with that. And going back right to the beginning of our themes, we have to survive in the moment. But sometimes that moment makes us miss opportunities or threats or things that we can do in the future. So as individuals, I think it's cultivating a sense of how do I understand how to think about the future? And especially how do I understand where my blind spots are? And so there's tools and techniques and things like that. For institutions, we're talking a lot about schools and everything. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a second before we move forward, Jake, would you be able to link us some of those tools and techniques so we could share them in our show notes? Because that would be great for people to hear about that, but then also to be able to go out and be able to educate themselves on that and be able to take advantage of some of those resources. So I think that would be great to just have a few of those resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some of it, is simple but very practical. Just to sort of almost reminders, like, just because it happened yesterday doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. Like those kind of things can be very useful. Or, just because you think you'd be happy as a CEO of this company, go talk to that CEO. And if that man or woman is not happy, that's probably a better indicator of whether you're going to be happy rather than you trying to guess yourself. Right. So little techniques like that can be powerful or making yourself like a concrete vision of the future. Like, I'm going to be X years old. My kids are going to be this old. And I'm going to be living in that household. So getting specific about the future can also help overcome some of those blind spots that we have. Anyway,
you suggest writing those things down.
Yeah. I can share some resources. A lot has happened in recent years, like understanding, and then also some practical tips. And my colleague Jane McGonigal at the Institute for the Future has done quite a bit of that, and others have as well. So yes, sharing resources.
That's awesome.
Institutional level, again, it's like, kind of the crux of how we get things done collectively. So, the field kind of came out of, as I mentioned, I didn't really get to follow up on that so much, but like World War II. And how do we not destroy ourselves as a species? And so a lot of it, like at least in the U.S., especially in the Western world, was kind of based on military strategy and then corporate strategy. Like, how do we get good at that? But, you see it in education, you see it in the healthcare system. There are some governments that employ this directly. So how do we, again, like collectively, sort of the grander version of that individual thing, not keep doing the wrong thing? Do we have to learn the hard way every time? And guess what? The hard way hits poor people harder. It hits marginalized people. It hits powerless people. They're the ones bearing the weight of mistakes, more than others. And so there's a justice argument to this as well. Like foresight can maybe, yes, collectively we make fewer mistakes, but those mistakes maybe don't hurt the people that don't have a say in that too. And collectively we need visions. This again, just to go back to these themes, we need something pulling us to the future. And it's not going to come from corporate boardrooms, or it shouldn't only come from corporate boardrooms, or government institutions, or think tanks, or something, or Hollywood even. Like, we all have a say in a kind of future that is magnetic, that can pull us forward. And I think that diversity of imagination could also be a force to say, all right, where are we going? And that, you know, those kind of voices and inputs are part of the story as well. So can we create institutions that, yes, help us avoid the worst, but also more than that, like lead us to collectively somewhere that we want to be? Educational system. We are at a moment where we can retell that story. What is it? What is it for? What's it supposed to be? How is it going to work? You know, and so having that and having people's voices that can have a say in that. I think we need that. You know, otherwise we're just going to repeat. Okay, well, yeah, it's like industrial education with a computer. Well, that's not really that very exciting, right? And then finally, the kind of grand level, which we've hinted at over a few times, as a species, we're not guaranteed to exist in a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that we're doing to the planet, the home, our home that we need to survive, we're stealing the future in some ways, and we're stealing from ourselves already. Mm-hmm. So how do we think about ourselves as a planetary species that can act? We don't do that. You can see the challenge as we build this up. We're not very good at personal foresight, although we have some tools. Our institutions are not great at it either. How in the heck are we supposed to be at a species level making these grand decisions about, how much carbon is supposed to be in the atmosphere and all of that? So it's even more difficult at a species level. But if we think about the world with that lens, and what are the things that we need to do? What are the institutions? What are the cultures? What are the stories we need to tell to say, how do we get through this? What do we need to do to protect Mother? To protect the Earth, to live on it. So those kind of grand things, are in play too. And I think that's why future studies and foresight came to be, because we were facing things at a scale that we never had before. It's not just an island culture, that whatever happens applies to that region. Everything now is applying to this planet and beyond. And so thinking like that is hard, both in time, thinking out in the future, but also in scale. Like thinking planetarily is difficult, and it's a load, it's an emotional weight if you do that. And part of the psychology of being a future thinker is carrying that weight. So that's another difficulty that we need to acknowledge and figure out how to do that effectively. Otherwise, we're going to burn out and we're going to just turn off because we can't deal with the challenge. It's too much, and that's valid. It does feel like too much sometimes.
Yeah, and that makes sense, man. And man, I want to thank before we hop off of here. I want to make sure that I thank you for sharing with us today and the work that you're doing. Helplessness, they say, is when you go to bed tonight and you can't see tomorrow being any better than it was today.
Right.
And the opposite of that is having hope. Being able to see a future that is better than today is hope. Mm-hmm. And my worldview especially, but even outside of that, hope is so essential for the human condition. And without it, we die. Or we prey on each other, and ultimately we die. And so, man, I want to thank you for what you shared with us today. I want to thank you for having this conversation. And it's just the first of many as we continue to look at what could be for our communities and for our educational system. So, man, we want to give you a big thanks. Jake, man, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Brill. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, and so, man, this is Jake Dunagan, futurist, here with us in the intersection. And we'll see you in just a few seconds as we start to unpack some of what he unloaded on us this morning and see what it can look like for us as we move forward today.
So, Brill, we're coming out of the session with Jake, speaking about the future of education. We spent time in the previous episode speaking with Melissa Roker, starting at the very beginning of education. Where are you at?
Man, for one, I don't know about how some of y'all feel, but that conversation was sky high. The weight of thinking about the future. And, he went to some doom and gloom sometime, but just thinking about the weight of our decisions now and how they affect the future. and then wrapping that back into something that is so common for most of us, something that most of us have a hand in, which is our educational system. For me, it puts a new perspective on, honestly, my responsibility as a parent and as a part of that system. Like he asked, like, what's our story, right? And that our systems are helping to replicate the story of who we are, and that we've put that weight on our systems. And so when my kids go off to school, it's not just learning their ABCs and learning pi. You know, it's a part of shaping who they are, which goes back to what we talked about, like the value of education, and how you talked about how education should probably be something that's treated as something that's essential, something that is
part
essential,
of the infrastructure.
like, part of the infrastructure, right? Part of the infrastructure, and then back to the value of community being a part of what we do in education. So today I got a name tag on from one of our local high schools. We built, if you don't know about this, we built Studio 104, which is where we are now. And we built it to allow students in our community to gain some real skills that allow them to move forward in the workforce and overturn some of the statistics that we see around poverty, right?
Yeah.
Today I got to go into the school where there was a teacher in the school advocating pulling her out of one of her classes so that she could come here and learn about these skills that she is passionate about, that can allow her to gain job skills. And it's like when I think about the weight of what we've been talking about, how our systems are developing the future of who these students are and how they affect the entire world, like the entire world. It puts a brand new weight on things like this, things like bridge builders, where we have this opportunity to really speak into the future generations.
And one of the things, tell me how this hit you. So when we opened the episode, and even when we closed the last episode and opened this one, talking about the opportunity for us to get to spend some time with Jake, who's a futurist.
Right.
And like you said, like it's real easy for that conversation to take off and be lofty. At parts of the episode, he verbally fought being cynical. How does it hit you that someone whose professional career, who spends time in this field every day thinking about the future, right? And when we talk about the future, we're not talking about next year or 5 years. Jake is regularly leading countries and governments through thinking about 75 to 100 years from now.
Right.
And he's having to fight cynicism. And so if it's hard for somebody who lives in that professional space of thinking about the future to fight cynicism, how much harder do you think right now it is for the everyday person to fight cynicism in this discussion of education?
Yeah. I think it's something that doing that is dang near supernatural. Especially when you're in an environment where you're also seeing hardships within that space. Like our local middle school just had over 100 suspensions last semester.
Yeah.
And when you're a parent who's seeing that, when you're a teacher who loves these students, cares about these students, are pouring into them day in, day out, and are doing everything that you can, and you see that, that has to do something to the way you start to see the future. But it also makes me think of how powerful the resiliency is of some of our educators to step into that space day after day, to have a plan, to constantly be trying to innovate and to make things better. That takes a level of hope that is magnanimous. It's incredible.
And for me, what it does is it makes the rest of this season so important. What I'm looking forward to, we're going to continue bringing in people that have different perspectives, that are involved in different pieces of the chain of our educational system. And I'm not just looking for them to point out where they need help or where it needs improvement, but I'm looking for them to share stories of the bright spot and what's going right and places of hope, because those stories are so valuable. Speaking about what's going right, why do I keep doing this? I think last season I spoke about in the game of golf when I was talking with Senator O'Shea about in the game of golf. They say it's mostly frustrating, but you hit that one shot where you feel it hit pure, and that's what brings you back the next time. And so each episode of the season, I'm going to be looking for that person to share
that pure shot,
that one pure shot that gets them coming back each day, each week, each semester, signing up for the next 180-day contract.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm just looking forward to in this. With Jake, there was times when he kind of could go there, and I love the principle of where we at, where we going, how do we get there, and then what do we do once we're there.
Yeah.
And so I think there's so much room and space and hope in that, and not just for cynicism. And so I get to see educators so often and talk to them and hear stories and see things that kids are doing. And it's one of those things that lights my heart. My 6-year-old son yesterday was showing us like he has this, what he calls this trick where he can say his spelling, he can spell his spelling words backwards.
Oh.
And so
all right.
And to think of a 6-year-old saying, yeah, I can spell all my spelling words backwards, right? He didn't get that to that point on his own.
Right.
There was somebody pointing to him, and so I'm looking forward to that.
Man, and speaking of that pure shot and those amazing stories, throughout the process of just preparing for this season, one thing that I've learned is just how important the school board is and how important being the head of a school board is and how much influence you have and how much you really get to see, how much of that weight really rides in that space. Because I didn't know that before. And so next week, I'm super excited because we get to sit with Mr. Frank Henderson, who's a personal friend of mine, but also the president of the National School Board Association of America. And so, man, I'm excited to sit with him and see like, hey, what are you seeing? How are you addressing it? But also, where are the bright spots? What are the pure shots that you've seen? And how do we expand those? How do we create more of those and shed light on those in our community and step in to create more of those opportunities?
And we got to keep it real. The school board space has been really contentious in the last couple of years. And it used to be one of the spots that people would love to run for elected office and to serve in. And now the landscape has totally changed. And so we got to hear about that also. I want to hear about the bright spots, but I want to hear that we have to keep it real in this intersection. And so,
hey, you can't recognize the sunshine without the rain.
Yeah, Come on. So I'm looking forward to hearing all that.
Yeah. Man, so, hey, we hope to see y'all here in another 2 weeks when we drop the next episode of South by East. We'll keep seeing y'all in the intersection. Thank you for tuning into the South by East podcast, where we meet you at the intersection of culture and community. For more information on resources shared, check the show notes, and we'll see you at the next